Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Nothing. That's all that Bobby left me.
Well, that's a real heartbreaking song. Well done, Dwayne. All right, we're on The Law Show, and we're talking about family law, and the song kind of set it up there. We're talking about people breaking up, going through separation, then divorce. So at a McQuarrie Hunter, when someone comes in to see you, you've made the call, we've got an appointment, come in, what happens?
Well, we rotate through the three of us. There's, for people who've just been, if they're a cold call, but any new client, we have a form that at the front desk when they check in. Our assistants will say, look, this new one's got to fill out the new information sheet. Gets name, basically name, rank, serial number for lack of better terms. A list of the assets, list of the children. Do you have children from previous relationships, previously married, those kind of things. And then it just gives us a bit of an idea. And we identify the person, we get their identification and such. And then they come in. For me, it's I give a flat rate for initial consult, and I think Sarah does as well. It's less than our hourly rate. And so they come in and they get
because they want to know if you're a right fit, right?
Exactly. And I'm not offended when someone comes in if it's not a fit, because you're going to be working very closely with your lawyer, so you have to be able to get along with the individuals. And sometimes it's personality. Someone may see Sarah and think that they want someone different. They come to me and they want Sarah. It just works out, right? And such. So they come in and we go over their basic information, find out what their issues are. How long are they actually separated, or are they just thinking of it? Mm-hmm. I've had people come in. And
what is that? What's the mix on that? Are most people just thinking about it, or are they actually?
I probably have 2/3 that have already separated, but I have a third or so that come in just for the information.
Which is probably a good idea, right?
It is. Get the so you know where you stand and what you may need when you are separating. And it sometimes come back about a year later and they finally decided. Yeah.
But I'm sure I'm leading into what's the emotional temperature.
Yes.
I'm sure either some people you've got to really pull it out of them, or the floodgates just open.
Yeah, usually I ask, I'll talk to them about the weather or the view, because often we meet them in a boardroom down on our side that has a nice view towards the San Juan Islands, and you can see the mountains.
I've got to get there. I want to see this view.
Yeah, you have to just come in. We'll give you a tour. We'll buy you lunch downstairs.
Excuse me.
And
take you up on that.
And they see the nice view and everything, and it calms them down a little. And then they I'll say, so what brings you to see me today? Nice general opening question, and often it is the floodgates. There have been times where maybe 20 minutes later I haven't gotten a word in edgewise, but I'll let the person talk, and I've figured out in my head as I've been making my notes what the issues are and what
Sarah,
we have to deal with.
Do you see patterns? Like when someone starts talking and they start telling you their story, everybody's different, and that's what you mentioned at the beginning, is that's what's unique about family law, is everyone's different, everyone's story, but there must be patterns.
Yeah, I think I would echo what David says. You usually know within the first few minutes what's going to happen, and whether it's going to be someone who you really have to dig to get the information out because perhaps they're not emotionally ready for the separation or whatever has happened with them, or, as David said, the floodgates are open and it's 20, 30, 40 minutes of everything that's piled up for them in the past.
Sometimes they're angry, right?
Mm-hmm. There's anger, there's tears, there's frustration, there's resentment, there's the whole gamut of emotion. Blame, definitely a lot of blame. But that's part of our job, is to sort of take that and we can try and turn it into as positive of an experience as we can while getting the information out.
And in that first consultation, do you sort of say, well, here, this is what it looks like to me that your options are?
Yeah.
You kind of give them a little bit of a possible game plan?
Exactly. So, often I'll say, look, this case should not see the inside of a courtroom for a trial. It should be resolved before. We're going to have to go through some steps. There are going to be some court appearances potentially, but it's likely to not have to go to trial. And, 95% of our cases settle before a matter anyway. Some of them will say, look, if your positions are this diametrically opposed, it may be a judge has to resolve it. But, we'll get the disclosure going between the parties, the assets, everything, and then go from there. And then try and sit down with the other lawyer and figure it out. So I do give them a game plan as to where I see the case going.
Do you see some cultural issues where, say, women in a culture that are supposed to be diminutive and not to speak up are coming in and they're finally getting their voice? Do they sometimes have a hard time exercising that?
Yeah, I say it's a mixture of the two. It's either they've had enough and they are just out to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the women that are really struggling to have their voice heard after 10, 15, 20 years of what is often an abusive relationship and things like that, and coming from a cultural background that maybe they have felt that their voice hasn't been heard. We have a lot of those cases, considering where their office is located. So it can throw another wrench into things, and we have to be sensitive to that, and we are aware of that because we have dealt with a lot of cases of that type.
The difficult part is every time I think that I may have figured out to some extent a cultural group, and
well, you're not part of the culture,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's hard on a normal basis that way to deal with it because there are subtleties from the different cultures, and given where our office is located, it's a polyglot area. It's some other parts of the province maybe not as much that way, but we are. What's interesting though, Zach, is that there's some groups that I think they're going to come in and say I'm acting for the wife and she's going to whatever the husband wants will give, and yet sometimes they're the most steadfast for their rights compared to some other ones who come in and give in. So you
never know.
Exactly. And I think it does depend as well if they were born in Canada or born outside. Because once they've been born in the country, they've grown up in the same school system and everything. So it's like, I don't have to put up with that.
Right.
Where sometimes some come in, it's a language issue.
Mm-hmm.
There can be, what am I going to do if I'm separated? Kind of thing. And where do I go from here?
The devil you know versus the devil you don't know, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
They feel scared to go on their own.
Exactly.
And people don't often know what resources there are for them, and that there are other options than staying in a marriage that's not working.
Now, do you see any trends in our market today? People cohabitating. There's been a change recently in the last few months about real estate that has put a real damper on the market. So what are the trends?
I personally am finding that I'm doing a lot more marriage or cohab agreements. A lot more people are staying separate and apart in the same residence.
What is separate and apart? That just means like one's in the basement, one's upstairs? Or
I even have ones where they're still in the same room, but they are mentally and physically essentially separated. It's logistically, financially not an option for everybody, because often it's one person having to buy the other person out, and it's not financially feasible given what's happened in the real estate market. That's had a huge impact, I think, on people's decisions whether to physically leave a marriage and a residence.
Because in the past, when I first started, usually it was the husband moved out and he got a basement suite somewhere, and
they stayed there forever.
Yeah, until they could figure it out. Exactly.
I joke.
No, but sometimes until the case was resolved, right? Yes. But now, if you figure, that was maybe when mortgage payments were $1,500, $1,800. Now they can be $3,000, $3,500. Your rents are maybe $1,500, $1,600.
And you need both incomes to just pay the mortgage.
Exactly. So they can't afford to move out. I haven't had a case like, as Sarah was just saying, where they're still in the same room. Usually they're in separate rooms, but if it's a 3-bedroom house and they have two children,
where do you go?
Where do they go? Sometimes,
sofa.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so that throws a different dynamic in when they're in the same home, because the parties don't want to move out because they think they lost the advantage. And legally they don't lose an advantage, but there's to some extent the incentive to resolve
Isn't
it for
that
the
old
person
saying,
at home.
possession is 9/10 of the law or whatever?
Exactly.
Like if I'm from these cold dead hands, right?
Exactly. So, the person who's in the home it loses some incentive to settle when the other one's out. So they don't want to leave, but it can create a very tense situation. Then how do you divide up the time with the children? How do you divide up the food in the fridge?
Well,
that
like
kind
a
of
nightmare.
stuff, right?
Stay married.
Yeah, it's never been quite as bad as that War of the Roses, where they put the tape down the middle of the home.
Yes, that was a good movie. Yeah.
Sometimes I swear it's almost been like that.
Yeah.
So what I was getting to with the real estate is that we've had a slowdown of recent time because of the tax that's come in and mortgage changes from Ottawa. So you have a family that's together and they're getting to the end of their divorce and they have to liquidate the home. Now their house isn't selling and they're stuck together even longer.
It can be. It hasn't affected us as much because I think that tax was probably directed more at like the really high $2.5, $3 million homes.
But I think overall sales are slower, right?
They are. I haven't had any clients complain that their house hasn't moved. But the hard thing is now, how do you determine the price? Like a few months ago, it was like
hot.
You get an appraisal in January, and in April it could be $50,000 off. Sure. Now, does it drop? No one really knows exactly how it's affected everything.
And do you do that? Do you say, well, we don't know the numbers until the house actually sells?
And
you
that's
work backwards.
That's usually the easiest way to resolve it. Is the house sells, and then you know exactly what the amount is. But sometimes someone wants to keep the house, so they have to get an official appraisal,
right.
And that's just a moment in time, and you never know. Like, the appraisal will say, I think this would sell for, we'll say, $800,000. But there's no competitive bid process where, the testosterone gets in and the guy says, they want $840, I'll give them $845, and then before you know it, it's $860. That kind of thing, right? We don't get that in an appraised situation. So the only real way to determine is to sell the home.
And of divorces, how many people actually liquidate the house and divide the money, or does usually one person try to keep it?
Probably about 2/3 do that. Sometimes it's just because they can't afford the mortgage on their own.
Yeah,
and that's the majority of cases. I would say is one person can't afford to keep or maintain the home, so it has to be sold. Especially
with the rising market and the increase in equity, you may have had to pay from the time of separation to the other, maybe another $100,000 of in there, and you just don't qualify for a mortgage enough to pay out the existing mortgage and pay the other side their half.
The flip side of that is the pressure that is on a family because of the high cost of living in Vancouver. Has this caused a lot of these divorces where you have $3,000 and $4,000 mortgages and car payments and he went and bought a boat and we can't afford a boat and oh yeah, for sure. And it's just anecdotal evidence for me, but it seems that people separate for monetary reasons. Often there's children issues or sexual issues. Those seem to be the three big ones. And often the monetary issue plays into everything else. The kids are in like 10 activities and they're just stretched financially and they just can't handle anything else. And it's a great source of arguments, isn't it?
Exactly.
The fighting over money.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're in such a unique market here. It's so different from anywhere else in Canada, I think. So it's finances are...
Is it worse when you have a saver versus a spender? Do you see that in relationships?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the core of a lot of my files is the different sort of financial ideas that each party has.
And I had a case like that where I acted for the saver who had saved a ton in RSPs and the house, he basically made all the house payments. And after a number of years, the other party just had debt, hadn't acquired any RSPs or anything. And the separation, everything's equalized because it was a long marriage. And it's not an easy... It's
not an easy conversation to have.
Exactly.
Is it? Yeah. By the way, all that stuff you saved,
yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what we're going to get into next. We're going to get into how are things divided? What is broken up? What can you bring into the marriage and take with you? What is allowed and not allowed? Well, do that when we come back with our guest, David Halkett, a partner at Macquarie Hunter and Sarah Morse associate. It's the Family Law Show on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.